basically have 2 months left before the summer break, and there's a lot to get done during that time yet. And the Lord is very good and gracious, and you're going to need to keep your focus on Him and apply yourself to your studies before the summer begins. In this particular class, we're going to be covering lesson number 10, pages 64 and 65 in your manual. And keep in mind that when it comes to exegesis and when it comes to Bible study methods and rules of interpretation, these rules of interpretation are very, very important to just keep in mind, be aware of. They do come into play. You know, one of the things, again, you never want to build a doctrine on one verse. I was just having a conversation with a Bible teacher Saturday night about that and the problem that arise when you start to do that. You know, again, you want to always look at context. You want to observe the content. You want to compare Scripture with Scripture to arrive at right conclusions. But there are rules of interpretation that do come into play. Furthermore, the Bible study methods part of this class that we covered quite briefly is all coming into play in our exegesis class as well. And you'll be able to draw upon some of those very things. So you should be turned to page 64 in your manual. And in doing so, I just want to cover some things related to this. You know, we've been looking at special rule number 1 about parables, special 2 about proverbs, now special rule number 3 about poetry. And remember to examine the figurative language and parallel structure of Hebrew poetry to determine its meaning. Now you keep in mind again with Hebrew poetry, does not rhyme sounds or words. It's not like the rain in Spain falls mainly on the plain. That's not how they do it in Hebrew. Instead, they rhyme ideas, thoughts, concepts, and images. That's what they're going to be rhyming. It contains many figures of speech and symbolic words when you're dealing with poetry. Now, that isn't necessarily true in the narrative passages, but that's going to be true with poetry, as we're going to see in a moment. Usually, here's a very important point, students. Usually, the second line will say something about the first line. The first line. By the way, does someone have access to on their computer to a concordance? Can you find the phrase 10,000 generations in the book of Psalms for me? I think it's 10,000 generations. So when it comes to this, let's see some examples. Go with me to Proverbs chapter 9. Proverbs chapter 9. Because again, sometimes what happens is simply the truth is restated. The truth is restated. And oftentimes that's the case. Proverbs chapter 9. It says, "Give instruction to a wise man, and he will be still wiser. Teach a just man, and he will increase in learning." Notice these are two parallel thoughts. These are called synthetic parallelism. In other words, they're basically saying the same thing. Now, sometimes in Hebrew poetry, though, you will have contrasting parallelism, as we'll see in a moment. But notice, give instruction to a wise man, he will be still wiser. Teach a just man, he will increase in learning. The idea in both cases, whether wise or just, is that he will be wiser or he will increase in learning. Now, they're not identical thoughts, but they're similar thoughts. Okay? Another example is to explain or emphasize the same truth. To restate the same truth, explain or emphasize the same truth. Proverbs 24, 1 and 2. "Do not be envious of evil men, nor desire to be with them, for their heart devises violence, and their lips talk of troublemaking." Notice this is explaining and emphasizing the same truth. We have evil men. We have those whose heart devises violence. Their lips talk of troublemaking, so don't be with them. Same kind of idea, just developed a little more. You have some poetry that state cause and effect. Commit your ways to the Lord and your thoughts will be established. So, this is the cause and this is the effect. Proverbs 5:22, his own iniquities entrap the wicked man, and he's caught in the cords of his sin. Cords of his sin mean he ends up in bondage. So his own iniquities entrap the wicked man, he's caught in the cords of his sin. So we see a cause and effect relationship there. Number 4, sometimes they make a contrast or a comparison. Do not correct a scoffer, lest he hate you. Rebuke a wise man, and he will love you. So we've got this scoffer versus a wise man, hate versus love, all based on whether they respond to the correction or rebuke or not. Now, you want to keep this in mind, okay? The usual parallel two-line couplet structure of Hebrew poetry is easily seen in Proverbs 9, verse 8. Do not rebuke a mocker, or he will hate you. Rebuke a wise man, he will love you. So again, we see this parallel thinking, but in a contrasting kind of way. Notice that line 2 contrasts the response of different people to being rebuked. Rule: always try to determine how line 2 impacts line 1. Know that. Always try to remember, you can star that in your manual. Always try to determine how line 2 impacts line 1. Okay? Did you happen to find it, Mark? 10,000 generations? Really? 8,000? 80,000. Oh, 1,000. Yeah, that's what I want. 1,000 generations. Where in Psalms is it? Okay, let's go there. Okay, is there more than one place where it's found? Okay, very good. In Psalm 107, verse 7, let's start there, okay? He is the Lord our God. His judgments are in all the earth. He remembers his covenant how long? Forever. The word which he commanded for a what? 1,000 generations. Okay, are you reading Psalm 105? Did we say 105? 105, verse 7. Okay? He is the Lord our God. His judgments are in all the earth. He remembers his covenant for how long? Forever. The word which he commanded is parallel to what? What is it parallel? His covenant, right? For 1,000 generations parallels what? Forever. The covenant which he made with Abraham and his oath to Isaac, and confirmed it to Jacob for a statute to Israel as a what? Everlasting covenant. So we've got everlasting covenant, we've got his covenant forever, and we've got 1,000 generations. Now, let me just say that I watched a presentation recently at a Bible conference that happened in the last month. And this man who taught this is a grace-oriented Bible teacher. He's dispensational. He believes in salvation by grace, eternal security. I mean, our beliefs would be very close and akin to his. But he was proposing that after the millennium, that there is another dispensation before the new heavens and new earth, and it was 1,000 generations. Because that phrase is used in the Pentateuch, it's used here in Psalms, and then he projected that phrase, 1,000 generations, and somehow tied it or attached it to verses in Ephesians that teaches in the ages to come. And therefore, he believes that after the millennium, there's going to be 1,000 generations of righteous people on the earth before the new heavens and new earth are established. And what you're really reading, or the new heavens and new earth, are really part of the 1,000 generations, and then after that is eternity future. So the new heavens and new earth are not really eternity future, Revelation 21 and 22. They're a part of the 1,000 generations of people who are born righteous. And there will be mass population during that time. There will be people populating the earth, da-da-da-da-da. And he used this verse to support it. Now, immediately when I saw the verse, I looked it up, and I looked, you know what, that's just Hebrew parallelism. Look at the parallelism. 1,000 generation is parallel to two other statements, one before and one after it. The one before it is what? Forever. One after it is everlasting. Everlasting covenant. One's everlasting, the other's forever, and then in between is 1,000 generations. So in just normal, good hermeneutic practice, in interpreting Old Testament poetry, one would arrive at the conclusion 1,000 generations is another way of saying what? Forever. Not a special dispensation. And then how do you then take it out of the Old Testament and somehow attach it to the end of Ephesians 1 or in Ephesians 3 or in Ephesians 2 that in the ages to come he might display his grace? And how do you connect A and B? But he did. And how many people bought into it, I don't know. There were some questions after. And I knew the guys that were asking questions. In fact, the two questions that came, both are pastors that have been here at conferences before. And they said, well, what about this? And another one said, well, what about this? And what about that? Because it didn't sit with them. And I thought, though, this was just a simple breakdown, and this passage could have resolved it. So I sent out an email to J.B. Hickson, and I sent out an email to Tom Stiegel, and I sent an email to John Brummett. And I said, I don't know, could you watch this presentation and tell me what you think of it? But here are my initial observations and responses. And they all looked at it within the next few days, and they responded back and said, absolutely. And in addition, boom, boom, and boom. But I thought, here is basic hermeneutics 101 when interpreting Old Testament poetry. Look for the parallelism. And to make 1,000 generations somehow stand up and bark when it has forever in front of it and everlasting after it is a serious failure to apply basic Hebrew poetry hermeneutics. So that's why what we're covering is something you do need to know, students. Because this man's built a whole doctrine on it. He's taught it to his church repeatedly. He's teaching in other places now. And some people are buying into it. And it's not like it's something that's just going to collapse a church. But what happens is this. Whenever you come up with something new and novel, it eventually becomes your distinctive. And therefore, it's the thing you're going to have to defend over and over again because it's new and novel. So pretty soon, this becomes your emphasis. Is this what we would want to be our emphasis? Never. Never. But that was the wrong conclusion. Okay? Hebrew poetry is contained primarily in Job, Psalms, Proverbs, and Song of Solomon, parts of books of prophecy like Isaiah, Jeremiah, etc., and uses many figures of speech and symbols. So let's take a look at two of them. Why don't we go to Job chapter 42 for a moment. Let's go to Job chapter 42. Identify lines 1 and 2. How does line 2 affect line 1? Then Job answered the Lord and said, I know that you can do everything, and that no purpose of yours can be withheld from you. Okay, that's verse 2. Now there's 2 lines to it. Does it restate the same truth? Does it explain or emphasize the same truth? Does it state a cause and effect? Does it make a contrast or comparison? How does line 2 clarify line 1? Any suggestions here? You can take the mic and speak into it if you have one.
I think line 2 is kind of the conclusion of what line 1 means. Because God can do everything, therefore nothing can be withheld from him.
Okay, so what you're seeing here is a cause and effect, aren't you? I know that you can do everything, therefore no purpose of yours can be withheld from you. There's a cause and effect relationship. It's kind of like this. Big picture, I know you can do everything. Smaller picture, no purpose of yours can be withheld from you. Okay, now let's go to Isaiah chapter 40 and verse 18. Isaiah chapter 40 and verse 18. You know, purpose 1 and 2 are very closely related. It's hard to distinguish, restate the same truth, or explain or emphasize the same truth. They're almost saying the same thing. But here in Isaiah 40, verse 18, to whom then will you liken God, or what likeness will you compare to him? Now, is that a contrast? No, that is clearly a what? It's restating or just simply explaining kind of the same truth. But it's basically restating it because it really doesn't, clarify with more detail the first. So the second line is basically restating the first. So what's the key when it comes to parallelism? What do you want to look for? What do you want to look for? How the second line affects the first line. That is the key. Okay? First of all, you want to make sure it's parallel. It may not be a parallelism. But if it is, how does the second line relate to the first line? That's what you want to know. Okay? Questions about this? Now that was a fast lesson. Partly, students, because we did cover Proverbs and Psalms last time, obviously we were in a position to cover that quickly. It will be. Yes, this will be a new lesson.